happens because of the revolution. And so I'm going to be really, really focusing on wanting you all to answer this question. What is revolution and when does it begin? Very often we say from 1763 to 1776, that's the road to revolution. And in 1776, we say the revolution begins because we have the Declaration of Independence. And then we have the after effects, the republic. What happens after revolution and how do we organize? So I am asking you, though, to not look at it that simply. I'm asking you to basically identify what is revolution. So kind of keep that in your head. And when does it begin? Oops. So between 1763 to 1776, as I said, a lot of historians will classify it as the road to the revolution. And yes, in a way it is. It's the road to the actual physical war revolution. And if that is your definition of revolution, 1776 fits the bill. Actually, 1775, we started fighting. But on the way there, that road to those events of 1775 and 1776, there's a different kind of revolution. There's a revolution of thought and of mind. And what I mean basically is that, think about it. Up to the French and Indian War, up to 1763, despite the Navigation Acts, despite hiccups and issues with the British government at times, despite the enforcement sometimes of laws, the colonies had been kind of left to do stuff on their own. Not completely. They had royal governors appointed by the crown. They had all local assemblies, local representative assemblies, where they had some kind of autonomy, where they actually kind of passed their own little laws over their colonies. But they kind of just did their own thing. And it was good. It had good results for England as well as the colonies. The colonies prospered. England prospered with the colonies prospering. But at the end of the French and Indian War, some things have changed. There is huge financial issues in England. They are, in essence, bankrupt. They had had to pay for mercenaries. They had had to pay for this war, and they've had basically used up a lot that was in their treasury. But the English are realizing that there is a lot of land now that has been given to them because of the Treaty of Paris, that the French have basically ceded over to the English. Cede, C-E-D-E, means to give, has given over to the English all their French territory up to the Mississippi River. There's a lot of land. And the colonists looked to this land as if it were just their backyard. It is for them. They are seeing it as their land, that they can expand there. But there's a small problem. Along the frontier, so we're talking about the Appalachian Mountains, there were still a lot of Native Americans, including the Hurons, that have been very loyal to the French. The French have left. They are not happy with the situation. They are attacking English colonists as the English colonists are coming into this territory. They are attacking on the frontier settlements. All of this takes money for the English to protect those colonists. They don't have the money to protect those colonists. For the colonists, they kind of feel they don't need England to protect them. They've lived on the frontier their whole life. They don't need England to send soldiers to protect them. So they don't see a problem. There's a perception problem here. But England is saying, no, you need protection on the frontier, and we can't afford it right now. We can't give you that. So we can almost say that maybe a revolution is starting with that simple perception problem. Because when you think about the American Revolution, what is the American Revolution? Well, it's not just the physical fighting, and it's not simply when they declare themselves independence and there's revolution. The revolution is more. The revolution is when 13 very independent British colonies that are in 1763 very happy to be English, very happy that they won the war, very happy that they have all this land. Yet, less than 20 years, those same colonies that were 13 independent British colonies have united to fight against their mother country. What created that one unit? What created in their head this idea that they had more similarities and that they were more close to each other in the Americas than they were to the English in England? That, I'm telling you, really is the American Revolution. When those colonists in their head and in their mind don't see themselves as English anymore, when they see themselves as Americans, products of this continent, of this experience, that they have more in common with Georgia and Massachusetts and Virginia than they do with the English in England. And that revolution is going to create commitment, sacrifice between the rich, the poor, the elite, the educated, the uneducated, the small farmer, from women, from men, from those that had military experience, from those that didn't. It's all that come together to see themselves differently and that are willing to die for this. That is the ultimate sacrifice. In 1763, right at the end of the war, the Treaty of Paris, this is a book I use, but they have a really good quote. The author is Divine, and he says in page 106, the colonists did not anticipate the oncoming of a national independence movement. In 1763, the idea of an independent United States of America probably really wasn't in anybody's horizon. The majority of the colonists were experiencing what we would call a post-war high. They were growing in population, relatively young population. The average age was in the 20s and 30s. Compared to England, they had a much younger population. So more dynamism, more excitement going on. Prosperity in the colonies was a much, much higher level. The standard living, day-to-day living, the standard way of life in the colonies was actually higher than what their English brothers would have had in England. And what I mean is that even the yeoman farmer, even the poor farmer, had a better existence in the American colonies. Possibly, you could simply say, because they had more access to food, they had more access to natural resources, they had more access to land opportunities. I mean, think about it. Even if you are very, very poor and you live in a small log cabin out in the frontier and you don't have money to go get food, you probably can still get and trap animals and eat and hunt. Now, that doesn't mean everything was prosperous in the colonies. There was a very unequal distribution of wealth, particularly the fact that it was in the South that you had the wealthiest of the wealthy. The South was the wealthiest region, but in the South, it wasn't like everybody was wealthy. It was those that were involved in a high degree with their cash crops, the planting elite, the ones that had the most land, the ones that had the most slaves. Slave value gave the South a lot of wealth. So that being said, you have to realize that the colonies, though, really were very excited to be part of England, especially after the successful end to the war against the French and the Native Americans. But there was something. There was something that was brooding some contempt. Like we ended the last lecture, they noticed things about the English. Well, okay, so they fought an old way of fighting. They could handle that, but there was other things they were starting to realize. And one of the things they were starting to realize was the way that England saw their role in the English economy. So, how does England see the colonies? We've talked about mercantilism, that the colonies basically exist for the good of the mother country, both as a place to get natural resources and as a market for the mother country's goods. But the colonies are seeing that England, through mercantilism, sees them as the cash cow, the golden goose that lays the famous golden egg. They are starting to resent that because they don't want to be just seen as kind of the cash cow. They are not the servant or the child of England. They don't see themselves as that. They are growing. They are growing in political awareness. They are growing in population. They are growing in financial prosperity. And they are starting to, in a way, to say, wait a minute, we want you to hear us. We want representation in England. And this is starting to be the little thorn that is really starting to create a much bigger problem. And here is actually a political cartoon from a Boston paper in the 1700s, and it's the Parliament of England cutting a goose, which is supposed to represent the Americas. And basically, they're cutting up this goose that represents those colonies for their benefit, not for obviously the goose's benefit or for the colony's benefit. So with that thorn already starting to bother them, that they don't have a say really in what's happening, there's other things that will cause mistrust. Now that mistrust with England is leading the colonists to have their own American identity, their own separate viewpoint. So what causes this American identity? Well, as I said, there is a big lack of trust with England. There is a big lack of trust with their mother country, partly because of the king and partly because of the English government, Parliament, and the political views and stands that Parliament takes. And just the plain old distance, communication links are causing a lot of misconceptions. So beginning with King George, what is happening as far as mistrust? So I'm going to jump over here to King George III. This is King George, one of his official portraits. And this is actually a clip from a movie called The Madness of King George. And basically, that is what is happening to King George III. There is a madness. He is not mentally well. It is documented. He is erratic. He fires his ministers constantly. There is no permanence really in dealing with the colonies. And throughout this whole period, he is becoming more and more and more obsessed with the colonies. In fact, when the colonies finally do revolt and when they actually do win their independence, he couldn't handle that. He was obsessed with them. I don't know if you've all seen Hamilton already, but you can almost see a little bit of that. He's like, you'll be back, you'll be back. He becomes obsessed with the colonies. You could not even talk to him later about the United States of America. It was a taboo taboo subject to him. But more than being obsessed with the colonies, he actually has mental issues. What he is at one point going caught a few times running through his castles naked. He is speaking very fast. You tell him something and he's having visions, and he is just completely off the wall. What we think happened to King George are a couple of things. There are theories that he may have had a venereal disease, a sexually transmitted disease, but we are starting to stay away from that now. We kind of believe that he had, how shall we say, lead poisoning, probably from the silverware and the dishes he used. He probably, through the paints that were around him, probably just accumulated too much lead in his body and was slowly being poisoned, and not on purpose. It was just part of what was happening. The other thing about King George is that there was some physical issues that were going on, which is why they think of the lead poisoning. It has been documented that his urine was completely black during this time period. So I believe that is one of the indications that it might be lead poisoning. Anyhow, he's not well. And he is passing some rules that are being that the colonies are not taking well. For example, he keeps the largest standing army during peacetime in colonies. That starts breeding a lot of resentment quickly. He says that it's to pacify the frontier. It is to protect the frontiersmen and to bring stability to the new lands and new territories that are now part of these English lands, including Quebec province, which is basically all of New France, and Florida, which was under the Spanish. But the colonists are looking at this going, wait a minute, the troops are supposed to protect us on the frontier, but they're in the port cities. We don't really like that. He also is increasing expenditures. He is saying that the colonists are going to have to start paying for these soldiers, but the colonists don't think the soldiers are effective in any way on the frontier. So those decisions, plus just some very crazy, erratic behavior, there's nothing really coming out of the king, no guidance and no way, no road to deal with the colonies other than he's obsessed with them. Another thing that is causing mistrust is Parliament and the way Parliament views its ministers as well as it views the role of the ministers. So looking at Parliament, we'll jump over here. We'll come back to communication. This is the English Parliament. This was actually done in the 1800s, so it wouldn't have been there in the 1700s. But the English Parliament is very similar, if you think about it, to our Congress. In fact, we get the idea of Congress in a way from English Parliament. The Parliament is representative and assembly for the English. There are two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons, the ministers, which would be our representatives, the ministers represent various counties and they meet in the lower chamber, the House of Commons. The House of Lords in England, and this is where it is different from us, the House of Lords is the upper chamber, so you would think of that as the Senate. But the House of Lords, these are people with titles given by the monarchy or hereditary titles that have been passed down. So these aren't elected on. So there you have in England this parliament that in some ways has some representative government. Now, Parliament sees its role as having complete supremacy over the colonies. They have the power to legislate, to make laws over everything that is English, over everything that means over the colonists. And in Parliament, the ministers, the representatives in the House of Commons, believe that those ministers not only represent directly the county, the area that they were voted in, but their responsibility is to all the English Empire. So they virtually also represent all the English all over. You could basically say that is virtual representation. The colonists don't like virtual representation. They want to have direct representation. They want to have their own representatives also in Parliament. They want to have their own ministers representing them in Parliament. Parliament looks to them the same way as you would say England, the whole of England looks at them. You are colonies. You exist for us. You don't get direct representation because you are colonies. If you want that kind of representation, move to England. That's kind of the way they look at it. And they say you are given a voice. All the ministers in the House of Commons represent your best interest. The colonies don't like that. Another thing that is leading to mistrust really is the communication between the colonies and England. And mainly it is because of distance. It is that distance that takes so long to get communications back and forth is causing misunderstandings and different perceptions that are leading more and more to misunderstanding. In the colonies, because they've had these local assemblies, these House of Burgesses like in Virginia, these representative assembly houses where they've elected some local officials, local representatives, and they pass kind of their own local laws, it becomes very American to believe that your representatives that you voted on have the authority to pass certain things over you because you gave them that power by voting them in, like taxing and how much the government spends. So the colonies are not against taxation and they don't mind paying their taxes, but what they want is representation. They want direct representation, and only where they have direct representation do they believe that can someone tax them. This becomes in England kind of this phrase, only an American thinks like an American. This is coming out of their experience, the American experience. You add to all of this John Locke. We talked about John Locke in the last lectures, the Enlightenment. In 1690, John Locke wrote a very, very powerful and persuasive essay called The Two Treatises of Government. And it was in the Two Treatises of Government that you see this definition and explaining of the social contract theory. And if you all remember the social contract theory, it was basically the idea that all of us have natural, inalienable rights that we are born with, the right to liberty, the right to prosperity, the right to live. And those rights have to be protected. And that is why we join under a government. We allow ourselves for a government to form us, to form over us. And we have a contract with that government. That government will protect our rights. But when those rights are violated, we have the right to rebel, to go against that. For the American colonists, John Locke has incredible influence. And I talked about his influence over Thomas Jefferson. The great Mr. Locke is what the colonists and Jefferson called John Locke. Here's Two Treatises of Government, in which he talks about the social contract theory. We're not going to get into self-sacrifice. But I did talk about John Adams. John Adams was a colonial lawyer in Boston. And John Adams is one of our founding fathers. He was one of the young men in Boston that had started to talk about governmental issues, the fact that we had no representation in England. And he later will become our second president. But he has a very famous quote that says, 13 clocks to strike together a perfection of mechanism which no artist had ever before effected. And what he's basically saying is that these 13 colonies, to finally unite, to finally work together in this union, was a masterful stroke of maybe luck, because it wasn't something that they could have ever seen. But it happened, and it was almost like a perfect peace, a perfect storm. But what caused that? It's kind of everything that leads to this revolution. So back to the results of the French and Indian War. What did England gain from the results? A lot of debt, bankrupt, but a lot of land. But with that land came big problems on the frontier, particularly because of Native American hostilities. And we can say that with all of this, the period of salutary neglect ends. And it ends in basically trying to deal with the Native Americans on the frontier. In 1763, if you all kind of just ignore the first 2 points, we're not going to get into talking about these. But in 1763, an Ottawa chief by the name of Pontiac, this is Pontiac, who had been allied with the French during the French and Indian War, are basically now left behind. And so what Pontiac is going to do is unite all these French allies that are left on the frontier and rebel against the English. And in the summer of 1763, you are going to have basically this big rebellion along the frontier where 2,000 colonists and Native Americans are killed. Eventually, the British will negotiate peace with Pontiac. But because of this, the British are saying that it is extremely hard to control the frontier. Not only is it hard, but it's going to cost more money than they can spend. With that, I'm going to jump over that. With that, because of these money issues, and because they don't have enough army to protect the colonists on the frontier, the English government is going to issue a huge proclamation. The Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 declares that all lands west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River are to be Indian reserves. Basically, colonists are prohibited from going there. They are prohibited from buying the lands. They are prohibited from going past the Appalachian Mountains. What England had noticed is that the colonists immediately, when they heard all this land was theirs, just started pouring onto these lands. And it just increased and antagonized the Native Americans. And so they just basically stopped the colonists from going there. With that, we can say the period of salutary neglect is over. Now, do the colonists pay attention to the Proclamation of 1763? Not really. They ignore it. As far as they're concerned, they're like, well, we can take care of ourselves. We don't need you. We can do it on our own. We'll spend our own money. It's okay. And because the boundary of the proclamation was kind of very haphazardly drawn, land speculators were quickly going over there and starting to sell the lands, and people were starting to pour across the Appalachian Mountains regardless. And so England is kind of like, wait a minute, wait, we told you don't, wait. What do the English see? The colonists need regulation. They definitely need some regulation. But the colonists are like, wait a minute, this is our backyard. This is our back door. You can't prevent us from going there. We can take care of ourselves. And more than that, maybe England isn't as strong as we think it is. They don't understand the American frontier. They don't understand the American way of life. So the English are realizing that the colonists may need some better control. But there is a much, much bigger issue for them, and that is the money, the search for revenue. So England is basically now starting to rationalize in a way. They are saying, wait a minute, we need to raise taxes. That's how a government creates revenue. They raise taxes. So they tell, in essence, to the colonists, the war was started in your lands. The war was for land that you wanted. It is your war, in essence. So y'all have to pay for that war. Sort of, England has a point. It wasn't just the colonists, though. It was England did fight the French because they wanted to fight the French. But England needs that money. They have to come up and overcome their war debt. They have to pay for the frontier costs. And then they're having their own economic recession, actually, in England. So England is just, they're trying to come up with money because they are basically broke. This problem of getting money is going to fall on Lord Grenville, who is basically the Secretary of the Treasury. In England, they would have called him the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he comes up with these points. He says the colonists should pay to maintain an army in the colonies. The colonists have to pay their share of the war debt. The war was fought on their territory and for their reasons. Basically, from this point on, everything that England does now is going to redefine the relationship they have with their colonies. The English will say it's about getting money. It's about being efficient in the way they govern. They are trying to better, they say, the navigation acts because they had failed. The colonists will see it differently. Lord Grenville will pass the first Revenue Act in 1764. This is known as the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act, its preambles basically says everything that I just talked about. It says it is just and necessary that a revenue be related in America for defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the same. So they're basically saying, we are doing this because you need to pay for your own protection. You need to pay for the war and for both of these, defending and protecting you. So what is the Sugar Act or the Revenue Act of 1764? It is a duty. A duty means a tax on imports. It is a duty on sugar, coffee, as well as a couple of other imports. It was a low tax. In fact, it probably was cheaper to just buy the sugar with this little tax on it than it was to buy smuggled sugar. Another aspect of this law stated that for better enforcement, England would have this writs of assistance made up. The writs of assistance were general warrants that allowed the English armies, English investigators, to go into private property, warehouses, for example, and check for smuggled sugar. It is a general warrant. So this can just be issued with no rhyme or reason. England said it was doing this to better enforce the Sugar Act. Another aspect of the Sugar Act was that if you were caught smuggling, you would then be tried by the Navy, the Admiralty Court. It did not allow a trial of your peers. It did not allow a trial by American colonists. It did not allow a trial, for that matter, even in the English civil system. The Sugar Act passed. People are irritated by it. There were formal petitions made by colonial assemblies, like the Virginia House of Burgesses, that were sent out in formal letters to the Parliament to say that this tax was unlawful. Why? They had no representation. They also stated in these formal petitions that they were loyal to the king. They were loyal to Parliament. But, and again, this tax was illegal, unlawful. It violated their rights. Why? They had no say, no direct representation. So therefore, they could not be taxed. However, the Sugar Act doesn't really affect everybody. Sugar was a luxury. And so it would have affected more of the well-to-do. It would have affected the merchants, the store owners that brought it into their stores, but it didn't affect the whole colonies. Another act trying to control the colonies after the French and Indian War is the Currency Act of 1764. The colonists, through the Currency Act, basically were told they could no longer print their own money. And by that, what had happened in the past was many of the colonists printed their own paper money. And England is saying, no, you can't do that anymore. If you want to pay for your debts, you have to use British gold and silver. You have to use actual British pounds, gold and silver, which a lot of people didn't have in the colonies, which is why they had been printing their own money. That was irritating to many of the colonies. In 1765, the Quartering Act is passed. The Quartering Act stated that the colonists had to provide the shelter for the soldiers that were in the colonies. They had to provide barracks. They had to provide food, supplies for the troops in the colonies. The idea was the soldiers were there to protect them, and so the colonists need to pay for them, need to house them, need to give them the supplies they need because they're there for them. England can't afford them. Many of the colonists see this as a tax. The other problem was that a good chunk of the colonists thought the redcoats, these soldiers from England, were totally ineffective. They were totally ineffective on the frontier. And why were they going to pay for these ineffective soldiers? And then you have the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 will have much larger repercussions. In March of 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act. This was a tax on a huge, diverse group of printed paper items, legal documents, newspapers, anything that used kind of official paper or printed, published paper. It would have affected almost every colonist in the Americas, of the British colonies. Marriage licenses, wills, land deeds, titles, and transfers, playing cards. To play cards, you would have had a stamp on that playing card deck. This was a tax, and then once you paid that tax, they would put a stamp or a seal on the item, and that meant you had paid the tax. And so it really affected almost every family in the 13 colonies. And it will have a huge negative response. The stamp distributors were supposed to be all over the colonies, and they were supposed to go into effect in November 1765. Colonists react. I mean, they are extremely irritated by this. Patrick Henry, a representative in the Virginia House of Burgesses, is going to usher what he calls the Virginia Resolves, and Virginia House of Burgesses passes these. These are kind of like Virginia issues. Virginia resolves the following. Virginia basically says that in Virginia, only the House of Burgesses could basically tax them because they actually had representatives that came directly from Virginians. So only Virginia can tax them. It really is about no representation. You cannot tax us. In fact, Patrick Henry's big speech on the floor of the Virginia House of Burgesses is that no taxation without representation. This idea, these resolves, spread throughout the colonies. For England, these are huge alarm bells. For the colonies, they are alarm bells as well, but in a different way. These are alarm bells that England is not allowing them representation. In Boston, you have a group that will quickly spread called the Sons of Liberty. Many of our founding fathers, including Samuel Adams, who is John Adams' cousin, he owned a bar in Boston, and a tavern, I should say, and he and many of his friends at the tavern are going to join the Sons of Liberty. John Adams was also a member of the Sons of Liberty. And this group was super diverse. You had super educated, wealthy people like John Adams, lawyers. And then you had, people that were uneducated, that were sailors off the ships off at Boston or came from lower farmer classes. It was just a really diverse group. What do? They protest. Sometimes their protests went a little too far and got very violent. The Sons of Liberty have kind of a female version. It's called the Daughters of Liberty, which were usually the wives. And the Daughters of Liberty are going to come out with a very interesting way to protest. Boycott. Boycott British goods. Do not buy British goods. And this is going to be our way of fighting this Stamp Act. Think about it, guys. I told you all last lecture, the colonies were about 1/4 of the English trade. We're a huge trading partner for England. We're not buying their goods. That's really going to hurt them. And what ends up happening is a huge crisis known as the Stamp Act crisis. But guys, it is 11:39. I know we go to 10:39. I know we go to 10:45, but I'm going to have to leave it here at the Stamp Act crisis because I have some important phone calls coming in. So I hope you all don't mind, but I have to cut the lecture 5 minutes short today. Think of all the times I go over. So this time you all get a shorter lecture. Have a good Tuesday. Stay safe and healthy. Look over your exams. And if you have any questions, please email me. Okay, guys, I'll let you all go.